Today we're going to talk about an important principle that affects our government, and it's one of the foundation principles, the separation of powers. As you would know from previous study, there are three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. These are articles of the Constitution. They're in that order, and they sort of reflect where the power lies, or where the founders thought the power would lie. They thought the legislative branch would be the most powerful because it could pass the laws. The executive branch was the second article of the Constitution, and the third was the judicial. There are many powers that are enumerated, but at the same time, the Constitution is very vague. So one of the important principles of the Constitution was this great compromise that created two chambers. One based on population with limited 2 terms, which was closer to the people, and a Senate which was elected by the state legislatures, which was less democratic, small d democratic we mean, not the Democratic Party, but small d democracy, meaning that the people didn't elect these senators directly. They had longer terms, 6-year terms, and they were considered a check on the more popular House body. But we want to return to this ambiguity of power. It's the beauty of the document is its ambiguity. It left many things to be worked out over time. So while it's very ambiguous in some parts, it can also be very specific in other parts and has many enumerated powers. But it's the vagueness that has allowed the Constitution to adapt to the present time. So to give a couple examples, there's in the legislative branch what's called the elastic clause. Elastic because it can be stretched to give the Congress more power. It says that the Congress can do anything that's necessary and proper to carry out the laws. Well, that's pretty broad, and it's been interpreted many times to give the Congress a great deal of power. So while we talk about limiting the government, we put in some ambiguous clauses that gave it more power. A similar one is the Interstate Commerce Clause, which allows the government to regulate commerce and trade among the various states and Indian tribes. So again, everything today can be considered commerce, whether it's buying things on the internet, whether it's shipping things across state lines, are all interstate commerce. The executive was also given vague powers. With the Constitution's first phrase in the executive clause says, "The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States." Now, it never really said what executive powers were, so it was left to the presidents to interpret that. That and the title Commander-in-Chief given to the president gave the president much power in war, as well as power to carry out executive orders and create what are called executive agreements, which are essentially treaties but don't get ratified by the Senate. So that phrase, executive power, gave presidents a great deal of power to interpret what that meant. The judiciary power is vested in the United States in one Supreme Court and other inferior courts that the Congress shall from time to time create and ordain. But it was left to the Supreme Court in an early decision, and a very famous decision, Marbury versus Madison, to say it was the court's responsibility to say what the law is. Where it didn't say explicitly in the Constitution that the Supreme Court shall interpret the Constitution, the judiciary took that power on itself in a reasoned decision of Marbury versus Madison. So we see that these separation of powers keep any branch from becoming too powerful. They give power to the government over the people. They have the separation of powers as sort of an innovation of the government. At the same time, each branch stretches its powers from time to time and are checked by the other branch. And that's what we'll talk about in the next section, is more explicitly these checks and balances that limit the separation of powers.